Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is J.D. Lorenzo. I'm the president of the Preservation League of New York State. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with Preservation League, but for those who aren't, we are New York's only statewide historic preservation not-for-profit. We champion historic preservation in every corner of this state, and we do that through a wide range of programs. We award grants, we administer loans, we award excellence in the field of historic preservation. We shine a light on endangered properties through our 7 to Save Endangered Properties program. We advocate for preservation at the local, state, and federal level. We offer technical services to property owners and grassroots preservationists like you. And of course, we host public programs like this one. I want to thank our sponsors for this event, the Peggy N. and Roger G. Gary Charitable Trust. Without their support, programs like this wouldn't be possible. And this webinar is part of our Preservation Book Club, a monthly series that is sometimes a traditional discussion group, like you might do if you were getting together with a group of friends, and sometimes it's an author talk like this one. And this evening, we are thrilled to welcome Roberta Brandes Gratz to speak about her new book, It's a Helluva Town, Joan K. Davidson and the J.M. Kaplan Fund, and the Fight for a Better New York. Roberta is a noted urbanist and a longtime trustee of the Preservation League. And today she'll be joined in conversation by preservationist Anthony Wood, who previously served as the chief program officer of the J.M. Kaplan Fund and is a former chairman of our board of trustees here at the League, and Amy Freitag, the current executive director of the J.M. Kaplan Fund. Now, before we get started, I want to let you know that we would welcome questions. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask Roberta or our panel, please access the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your question. And during and predominantly after the event is the speaking is concluded, Tony will get to as many of them of your questions as he can. So with that, I want to turn it over to Tony and to Roberta and to Amy.
Thank you, Jay. Well, let me give you a little sense of what's in store for you on today's program. I'm going to start with just a little, very, very brief history of the relationship between the fund and the league, because it's very special, but I think it also kind of illustrates the type of philanthropy that the fund has engaged in over time. So after that, we're going to talk about the book itself. We're going to explore Joan Davidson and the fund's work in New York State. We're going to kind of explore and examine some of the distinguishing features of how the fund and Joan did their philanthropy and still do. And then I think even bringing it into modern times, if you will, or contemporary times, is explore some of the insights in the book that I think will help inspire towns and communities around New York State as we all try to get things back to normal, how we get our economy back, how we get small towns revitalized, how we kick New York City back into gear. So that's kind of the outline for today's talk. So looking at the league and the fund together, from 1980 to 2017, the fund has given the league 46 grants, which is really outstanding. And they really show the range of support that the fund gives. So some of that was capacity building. Any of you who are involved in nonprofits know the hardest money to get is general support. And time and again, the fund provided that to the league. But it also helped launch new ongoing programs like the Technical Assistance Program and the legal program that for many years was up there. And then signature to Joan and the fund are publications. And there's like a mini publication program with the league. There was this wonderful book by Brendan Gill, which some people of my age on this call will remember, which also came with a film in 1984. In the pre-internet time, if you wanted to know who was doing preservation around the state, you needed the Preservation Directory, also funded by the J.M. Kaplan Fund. And even still, if you wanted to know everybody that was on every place in New York on the National Register, courtesy of the J.M. Kaplan Fund and the Preservation League. So again, illustrating the value and the commitment to publications that Joan and the fund have had. And then advocacy. The fund was very involved in supporting the league's effort to save Camp Sagamore back in the early 1980s. So advocacy has also been part of the DNA of what the fund got excited about. And of course, special projects. who can forget Architectural Heritage Year of 1985, which was a league initiative funded also by the fund and others. And then the Signature Rural New York program, which we'll talk about a little later. And more recently, in 2013, an Industrial Heritage Project. So the involvement between the funder and the organization do kind of cover time, and I think is illustrative of the fund's willingness to be there for the long haul, play the long game, get close to a group and help it build its capacity and build it to, I mean, the league is, nothing's competitive. We're not going to say whether it's the #1 statewide preservation group in the country, but it's the very top. And that's, I think, due to all the hard work of the league, but also that ongoing support of the fund. So let's turn to the book itself. And kind of everything has a backstory. So Amy, I thought it'd be fun to start with you. Kind of what was the fund hoping that this book would accomplish in terms of telling the story? And before you answer that, I just think we should all commend the fund for taking the time and investing in capturing its history. There are too many organizations that do wonderful work, and they only think about their history when it's too late to accurately tell it. So, I mean, kudos to the trustees and to you for focusing on this effort. But give us some of the backstory.
Well, Tony and Roberta and Jay, it's such a great honor to be here, and thanks to the League for hosting this discussion. And you know, I think Roberta and I sat down over coffee, I want to say in 2014, was it, Roberta? And I was relatively new to the fund and, well, certainly never new to the fund because I had been a grantee of the fund and been involved with, you know, lots of preservation activities that Joan and Peter and Betsy and so many members of the family have been involved in over the years. But when I came to the fund as an executive director, I mean, I think Roberta and I both sort of had this moment of recognition that here we had this extraordinary president emeritus who had done all these remarkable things. And unlike so many other remarkable people that we know in any one field, the fund had been extraordinary across many fields. And Joan really was such an important sort of catalyst to so many great things. And we realized that this would be a great story to capture. And at a moment we should do so as the fund was approaching its then 70th anniversary and Joan's 90th birthday. And so we sort of put our heads together and I thought, oh, well, why don't we do a documentary? Do you remember that, Roberta? And you're like, Amy, it can't be a documentary. This is Joan Davidson. It must be a book. And that's really, I think, some of the genesis. Roberta then took off like a steam locomotive or whatever analogy we should have, but she really took off after capturing so much history and so many oral histories that led to this. So not only did we end up with a wonderful book, but we also ended up with an archive full of transcribed interviews that Roberta had done both long time ago, including her work around Carnegie Hall, but then most recently around the sort of legacy of the fund.
Roberta, you've known Joan, you know, for a long, long time. And even had written about Joan, if my memory is right, in an article many, many years ago. So taking on the book, were there any kind of particular challenges? I mean, writing about somebody who you knew so well, but in terms of the resources you had to work with, I know the oral histories were key, but from a writer's perspective, what were the challenges getting your head around such a diverse also set of topics and subjects in terms of
well, the real story is that I knew that of the past I guess 50 years, Joan and the fund were so integral to the history of New York that I knew that history. I've been writing about it since the early 70s, and that's when I first met Joan. So I figured, not that it would be a piece of cake by any means, but I certainly knew that I had the foundation to work with in terms of the history in New York. And I think one of the things that pleased me was that by telling this story, I return or actually tell for the first time for many people important chapters of our New York history that they either never knew or forgot or didn't know were so important. Because Joan was at the forefront of the innovative activities, particularly of local groups. And so she was unafraid to be the first to fund things that then turned into mega projects or big issues, and was totally bold in funding legal lawsuits. I did meet Joan early 70s because I was already writing stories about the things that she and the fund were doing. And in fact, I came across an article I wrote about, a big article for the old New York Post. We have to remember what that means. A 1974 article, and rereading it, I have to say it was pretty good. So I knew her, we became friends, and certainly we became allies in some of the big fights that we all look back on, for better or worse.
Amy, since you were kind of relatively new to the fund as an employee when this started, but you'd been in the nonprofit space. So I'm curious, did you learn, were you surprised by anything that came out? I know you've been very involved in the parks world, and the fund played such a deep role in New York parks, but did anything kind of surprise you? Like, wow, I didn't know that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is such a rich history. And I think, there was sort of like an onion, you just sort of kept unpeeling the layers of it. And, just deep history around the history of housing in New York City, and the advocacy around a better city plan, right? So just the work around, thinking about transportation. There's just a lot of depth that happened in terms of consideration of the critical elements that make a livable city. And that's something certainly Roberta understood so well, and in looking at this sort of diversity. But I remember thinking about, like, is it Twin Parks up in the Bronx, and commissioning great architects, not just for places like Westbeth, but other great architects, designers, engaged city planners, thinking about what would make New York City be the most livable and productive city for everyone. So there was definitely chapters and work that I had never heard of. And, I think it was because of Roberta's deep knowledge of the city, but also her voice that had really been a part of a lot of those early battles, that Joan really felt comfortable with someone like Roberta handling those stories and really being able to tell them in a way that gave real integrity, not just to what the fund did. What I think what's great about Roberta's work is she lifted up what Joan would call another good person. Everyone in this book is another good person. There was such an extraordinary amount of collaboration that happened with the fund, empowering people to do great work, like Bob Hayes working with the homeless, and groups that that maybe, but for this book, people that wouldn't necessarily get their stories told. So I really commend Roberta for making that rich history come to life.
Many people, I think, know probably more about the fund's work in New York City than across the state. And Roberta, in a sense, my sense is that Joan was kind of this Pied Piper that kind of made at least people within the 5 boroughs realize that there was a thing called New York State, and it was wonderful, and it was incredible, and it was just hours away. And maybe you could talk a little about her role. I know this is going to sound, she put the Hudson River on the map. That's ridiculous, but she really did for many people.
There are really 2 major parts to that story, and one is kind of amusing, and that is there was a bus trip, and Joan, who had obviously discovered that there was a place north of Westchester County, wanted the rest of the world to understand that. So she and Winty Aldrich put together, of course, Winty did a lot of the map work, but put together a bus tour. And she invited a host of people, including members of the press. And it was when I was either still at the Post or just after. And I was on that bus trip. And she captured me like she captured a lot of other people. I fell in love with upstate and followed her not long after she bought a house. I bought a house. And we discovered some wonderful sites that no one ever knew about, and that the fund was funding. And then she sent you, Tony, off to the Netherlands to discover that there was a godlike place north of Westchester, and came back with all sorts of ideas. The important thing with the Rural New York program was the same thing that was true in the city, and that was that small grants could make a big difference. And if there's one story, if there's one overarching theme of the book, it's that small grants can be the beginning of big things. And then a theme that I've written several books about is how cities and places revive from the bottom up, from the community up, not from the top down. And the other thing about the Hudson River was I knew nothing about the fight over the Hudson and the power plant, the Con Ed plant, in which out of which came the NRDC, the National Resource Defense Council, and a number of people who now are, part of our everyday fabric. And Joan was one of the early believers and early funders, and in effect, saved the Hudson. So, okay, it may be too much to say that Joan Davidson saved the Hudson, but she helped lead the way. She was one of a few of the first to realize this was a dramatic story and needed support. So that's the other thing. Nowhere in the book am I trying to say that Joan was the Joan of Arc of all places, but she was one of what would have been a small group, encouraged others, was what I call the good housekeeping seal of approval. When Kaplan gave a grant, it was to some obscure person or place, it was a sign to other philanthropies that this was legitimate. And that was very important, as important as the money itself. So the Hudson story was, for me, a great new one. I love some of the stories in the book were new to me, but and there are stories that didn't get covered because either, we just couldn't do everything, and some have emerged since the book was published. And I called Joan. I said, "You didn't tell me about." She said, "Oh, I guess I forgot." Well, so it's not that the book is definitive. There are more stories, but what is definitive is that one person, one organization, one philanthropy, in many, many small, impactful ways, can make a huge difference. And that's the major message I'd like this audience and any reader of the book to get.
Does that suggest there may be a sequel to this?
Oh God, no. I have another direction.
Stories, but one of the things you were saying, Roberta, about the fund, identifying individuals and kind of lifting them up and empowering them, even if they were in obscure parts of the universe, if you will. That's kind of a fun segue, because the Rural New York program, which kind of did that, is kind of, in a way, similar to what the fund's now doing with its innovation prize. And so, Amy, kind of you've now seen the history and kind of the historic DNA of how the fund operated. How much of that is still, do you see in what the fund's doing today? And I think the innovation prize suggests to me that there's lifting up people, betting on the jockey, not the horse, being in there early, that all of those things still are very much of how the fund thinks.
Yeah, so for the people listening that don't necessarily know our Innovation Prize, the Kaplan Fund every 2 years puts out a call for very early stage innovative projects with the goal of giving them the critical first years of support to really lift up this idea. And I'm going to tell you that was completely taken from the playbook of JM and Joan Davidson, who took some really high risk, high reward bets on, let's say, Barry Benepi in 1976 to create green markets in New York City. Somebody, who is going to bring a bunch of farmers from the Hudson Valley into one of the most drug infested parks in the city? But it was transformative to the life of the city. So that is really the sort of DNA that we conjure up every 2 years when we do the Innovation Prize. But Tony, I would argue that our Innovation Prize, the greatest compliment ever was when Joan said, "This looks very much like my program." It was the greatest compliment ever from her. But I would argue that in small ways, the fund has continued that legacy that Roberta spoke of as sort of small, early, got the eye on the next leader, the next opportunity kind of grant. So even as recently as the beginning of the de Blasio administration, when the Kaplan Fund had funded for a very modest $5,000, an idea, a white paper of what would make the best municipal ID card for immigrants in a city. And through that paper, we influenced the administration that ultimately launched NYCID, which has been replicated in more than 24 cities across the country. And that was really the work of our wonderful colleague, Suzette Brooks Masters. But the point being is that I still think there are opportunities where you can make a really smart bet on an early stage idea. And that really is a beautiful history told by Roberta in this book.
And Tony, let me add something. I think there are a couple of examples in the book, I'm sure more than I even knew, where an innovation in New York, like the small parks, the pocket parks, became a national trend. The first one on 103rd, I guess it was, was a great success. And then Bobby Kennedy came, and this one came, and that, before you knew it, it was around the country. So we already know that New York is a leader. I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but cities elsewhere keep an eye on what New York is doing. So many of the things, the green markets, they were first in New York. And well, there were markets in other cities, but this particular style, the point is, a lot of these success stories bred success stories outside of New York. And the same message pertains. It's still the small, targeted, individual belief in an individual, bottom up. It works every time. Now, this is not this is not what you hear from the policy experts. They're all talking, and we know about it now. How will New York revive? Well, we need more super tall buildings. Give me a break. That's not what's going to revive New York. New York is going to revive. I don't even think it's as dead as a lot of people. I love it now. But it's the same things are going to happen from here on in that happened in the 1970s. And it's happening now. It's local. It's people who may be right now on Zoom, but when they can get out, when they can go in and open a local neighborhood store or get out to do something locally off Zoom, it's going to happen. And that's not going to be from the top down. Hello, Wall Street. Hello, City Hall. Learn the lessons. Read this book, but they won't. So it will continue to be up to those local fighters to show what can and should be done.
Amy, I'm thinking that we should add to the list of people getting copies of the book all the mayoral candidates. And expand that maybe to the borough presidents, because I think it is fascinating about looking at the parallel. I mean, I think that's one reason this book is so timely, is when you look at where New York was in the 1970s and how it did build itself up. and because of these projects, are there any more of those small projects that we'd like to highlight that kind of help illustrate, how those small actions, when combined, really began to make something, hit the tipping point? I mean, Amy, are there any that jump out to you?
Well, I feel like the whole long enduring commitment the fund has had to public parks, and one of my favorite stories is just sort of the whole commitment to the conservancies and trying to first start off with Central Park and being one of the early people to support Betsy Barlow Rogers and the work that was going on at the Parks Department to create a new public-private partnership. And, Kaplan was one of the very first grants received in that effort, the first grant received by the Prospect Park Alliance, and now as recently as the first grant received by the Friends of the High Line. And just to Roberta's earlier comment, I remember speaking to Robert Hammond about that. And I remember him saying, like, when we got the check, it was like, oh my God, now we really have to do this. Like, this is a serious grant from a serious funder. We have to seriously make something happen. And look what happened. So I feel like, we love to say that it's great that Central Park was reborn through the work of the Conservancy, but it wasn't just the park that got revived. It really was a model of a public-private partnership that was spread around the world, really. So there's some pretty remarkable bets on public parks that are some of my favorite early Kaplan grants.
And let me just add, on the High Line, I know funders who turned them down. So when they got the first check from Kaplan, it was meaningful. I know myself, as being the leader of the restoration of the Elgin Street Synagogue, getting the first Kaplan grant was our meal ticket to have the courage and the enthusiasm and the belief that this could happen. And on the Central Park Conservancy story, is a very interesting one because it wasn't about as much about money as it was about Joan's thinking about it, because Gordon Davis tells a really interesting story that he used Joan as a sounding board on the structure he was trying to create for the Conservancy, and he kept sending her stuff, and she'd say no. It looks too much like you're giving public property away to private wealth. And finally, he said, "That's it, no document. Let's just do it." And so they did it without an agreement, a written agreement, and it emerged through time on its own. And so Joan served in a formative capacity in a lot of different projects, not just about writing checks. She is to this day so smart about understanding what can happen when others say, "Oh, that'll never happen." Oh, she'll say, "No, don't be so sure." So this is the other thing. It's not just about writing checks, and it's not even just about, giving support where it is desperately needed first. It's also about thinking about recognizing where the opportunities are. And Tony, I have to give you a shout out because you were head of the Rural Properties Program, and you brought those ideas to Joan, and you had a great partnership going there because you both thought alike. And that's why I'm trying to emphasize the attitude, the being open to these ideas is just as important as being ready to write that first check.
Tony, can I do a further shout out? I mean, I do think one of the extraordinary things about the Kaplan Fund, now this is not including me, but I will say that there has been some pretty remarkable talent that has been among the alumni of the organization. So even after Joan was no longer actively making the day-to-day grants at the Kaplan Fund, I think that legacy of work was really embraced by people like Allison Wheeler Bauer, Laura Hansen, John Oddie. They're just such an extraordinary group
Dan
of people.
Davis.
Oh, and yes,
Suzanne Davis, Henry Ng. So there was like a dream team that has been surrounding the work of the Kaplan Fund for a long time. And I think it was a great honor. It continues to be a great honor for those of us that get to work with the family and do the work of their philanthropy.
well, I'm glad we're kind of talking about Joan's personal style of philanthropy, and because I think it's, you know, she did and still does. She keeps fun in the philanthropic process. I remember driving around New York State with her, and I guess we were late some night. We were all singing camp songs in the car. But you know, you'd meet with somebody upstate, you know, a local group that was asking us for money, and here was, you know, Joan Davidson from New York, and you know, a little team with her, and we'd have lunch, you know, and Joan would order a beer, and that just sent the signal to them that this is a fun. This is a person I can talk to, and Joan could listen and relate. And I think that personal kind of approach is also a hallmark of that relationship the fund has with its had and still has with its grantee. So, and I think you've captured some of that well in the book, Roberta. That kind of the Joan personal style.
Well, you know, I'm not very knowledgeable about all the different philanthropies around, but one of the things that I think made this special is that, and this was true of the Astor Foundation too, she kept it small, so that there was not a big distance between Joan and the grantees. I mean, there was you or whomever else, and then there was the grantee. Brooke Astor was the same thing with Linda Gillies, and then there was the grantee. There wasn't a whole hierarchy of people that you had to go through in order to get, you know, get an okay from up above. And I don't know how philanthropies are structured today, but it's a real lesson on how things can happen, where more of the money goes into the grants than into the whole hierarchy of the process. But that was very true of Joan. She knew exactly what the project was and came. I mean, again, my own experience at Eldridge, she brought JM and Sasha Schneider to see the synagogue. And that was it. And JM was enthralled, and she was enthralled. And, you know, that's what you want. You want your funder to share your enthusiasm. And if that has to go through layers of bureaucracy, it dims as it goes through. And with the Kaplan Fund, it never dimmed because you were all pretty close to Joan.
And I would say, Tony, the other thing I know that Joan always really was proud of the fact that, you know, the minimum, not only the minimum bureaucracy, but the minimum ask of the grantee to not tons of paperwork, tons of application, tons of letters and contracts. It really was about keeping it simple and keeping it fast and nimble. And I feel like that's something we've really tried to perpetuate, especially with things like the Innovation Prize, to really keep a real high level of trust between the fund and the grantees. And that, you know, I feel like is something that philanthropy right now is trying to get back to. I don't think the Kaplan Fund ever left that.
I would agree. I mean, I think the Kaplan Fund does philanthropy the way some people are thinking, oh, wouldn't it be nice to be nice to our grantees and be human and not ask for endless reports and treat them with respect? And it's like, okay, yeah, follow the Kaplan model. I think that.
Well, you know, Suzanne Davis told the story of Barry Benepe coming in, seeking a grant for a study about the green markets. And they had this conversation, and finally Suzanne says, Barry, you don't need a study. Let's just do it. And they did, without a study or whatever. Barry knew all that you needed to know, and you know, in order to just do it. And Suzanne was smart enough and had the freedom to say, we don't need a study. We don't need a piece of paper. Let's just do it. And they did it. And
another example in your book that kind of shows the the out of the box way the fund has been and willing to work is when the fund wanted to get involved around AIDS issues and realized that Tom Stoddard and Lambda were the place to put their money. We had to chase him. It's in your book. We had to chase him down to get a proposal, and then we gave him twice what he asked for. But I mean, that's a foundation with a vision and the ability to be nimble and flexible, and a leadership that allowed that. I'm going to try and take us back a little because I think we began it, but I'd like to go a little deeper in terms of, again, this moment in time we're in now. And Roberta, what you were beginning to talk about, and Amy, in terms of how the city and towns upstate, around the state, I mean, it's not going to be top down. We're not going to build our way out of this despite what, the real estate board would like us to believe. So in terms of how we can use some of these examples again in the book to help inspire people in terms of innovative approaches, and maybe it's just reading, as you were saying, people who've had an idea, somebody listened respectfully, got excited, and gave them small money, and it began to bubble. But how do we get a critical mass of that going on in the city and elsewhere? And I'm also going to just say to our audience, which sadly we can't see in this setup, but I know you're all out there in the dark. If there are questions that you've been hankering to ask, please either put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and unless they're problematic, I'll be happy to pass them on to Amy and Roberta. But let's just talk about kind of lessons, inspiration in here for right now, what we need in the state.
Well, I think right now, the city, all over the city, there are a lot of people with really good ideas, but feeling discouraged because who cannot be discouraged during a pandemic? There's something about knowing that there's a whole generation of similar kind of potential activists who succeeded. Not everybody succeeded. I don't want anybody to get the impression that these things all succeeded, but I think the story today is that people have to believe in what they know the city is truly about. They have to stand up for their neighborhood. They have to know what the values are that they're fighting for, and just do it. We won some fights, we lost some. We won Westway, we lost the theaters. But they were all, even the losses had benefits. So if there's any message in this book is that people should not be discouraged. And I'm not saying they can rush right out and send a grant application to Amy. I think that's the wrong message to get. But they should certainly, a lot of the people who got those early grants already had something started. They weren't asking for money to start something. They already had something going. And I think that's the today, that's the tomorrow that we need to think about today and get the energy to fight for. And it has to be out there in the neighborhoods. And I think in this upcoming race, there's so many. I mean, I think it's a great idea, send the book to all of them, but there's so many of them. I don't know how many of them really know the city. And I don't know how many know how the city really operates, and what they can do to change things, or really listen to the people in the neighborhoods that really know better than the experts. And that's what the success of the 70s and what the successes in this book really show. So be positive.
So I will just build on that by saying, Tony, I think I do want actually people to go to the J.M. Kaplan Fund website and click on the Innovation Prize application to actually. You
had to say that.
I had to say it, but thank you, Roberta. I appreciate the protective nature, but the idea that this is the moment to invest in innovation, right? That's what I love about what Roberta's book talks about, is how the Kaplan Fund was thinking about innovation and creativity when other people told, New York City to drop dead, right? They were digging in and investing in the natural talent of that's what Roberta's referring to, this grassroots talent and inspiration. And I actually think the fund is a lot of grant makers this year thought we'll just retrench and fund our existing grantees. We won't seek new grantees. And I think, to the credit of the Kaplan Fund trustees, I said, no, this is when we do innovation. This is when we really invest in new ideas. And so we actually do hope a lot of people will come forward with their new ideas that help address this moment of COVID. And I will just say that I think in addition to that, the fund has really been trying to look at the overall COVID landscape and look at where gaps might exist. I think we found a big concern around parks and open space when at a moment when New Yorkers needed their parks more than ever was a time when the city was radically cutting back on their parks, and all of our wonderful park conservancies who are used to having a spring gala to do their work couldn't do that this year. So the other piece of Joan's sort of DNA of the Kaplan Fund is the power of convening and coming together with other funders and building power together. And we certainly found that in the New York City Green Fund this year, which if people still want to contribute to the New York City Green Fund, they can do that on the City Parks Foundation website. But point being is that there's lots of opportunity to invest at this moment to see the city that will evolve post-COVID. And it's going to be exciting and vibrant. I really believe it.
Okay, we have a few questions coming in, so I'm going to kind of put them up. The first question is the type anybody would love to have asked, which is, where can you get a book? If you buy now, we'll send you 3 copies just for the extra price. Anyway, I think that we direct people pretty much to the. Well,
we love to direct them to a good old New York City bookstore like the
Absolutely.
Strand.
Absolutely.
But certainly the publisher has, you go onto the website and you can find lots of places to buy the book. So we hope people do and share it with your friends.
Several people have told me they bought their copy in my neighborhood Shakespeare and Company on the Upper West Side. And in keeping with the feelings of all of this, go to your local bookstore and order it. They may even order 2 and keep 1 for somebody to discover.
My mother ran a bookstore for years, and that's what she always did. We had a lot of those extras, however, over the years. Strategy at the time. Another question is, and this is we should have been a little more clear about this. Who is JM? Oh, who wants to take that, and not exhaustively, but just to set the stage.
Let's hear it, Roberta.
The simple answer is J.M. Kaplan is Joan's father, who started the fund in 1947 with money that he had made selling Welch's grape juice, among other things. But I have to add that J.M. had a lot of the qualities that we then saw in Joan. He was a fighter, and the story that I opened the book with that most people do not know is how J.M. was critical in the saving of Carnegie Hall when it would have been demolished because Lincoln Center was being built and nobody thought the city could handle more than one concert hall. So it was on the verge of being demolished to be replaced by a tower. And Isaac Stern went to J.M., and J.M. responded immediately the way Joan responded years later. And the next thing you knew, J.M. was funding the fight to save Carnegie Hall and with many other things. But the easy answer, he was Joan's father and the founder of the fund.
And Tony, I should just make sure that we sort of assume everybody knows that the Kaplan Fund is still an exclusively family governed foundation, and we are under the 3rd generation of leadership. Joan's son, Peter Davidson, is our chair, and he, along with his siblings and cousins, there's 7 trustees of the 3rd generation that run the fund. And now we're looking to a 4th generation of Kaplans that are interested in the work of the fund and have been really inspired by the book. So we're super grateful that the book has come out at a moment when we're starting to onboard a next generation of Kaplan family members.
And I think the only long-term family-directed fund in the city. I think most of the family funds are gone. So I forget who told me this, so I don't swear by it, but at least unusual, if not only.
In talking about JM, it would be remiss not to also mention at least the name of Ray Rubinow, who was kind of JM's on the ground, get it done, wonderful, wonderful activist. So he's mentioned in the book. So, you know, look.
Well, quickly he helped the fund get behind the effort to save Penn Station and the effort to save Washington Square Park when Moses was trying to put the road through the park, among other things.
As well as that great planning study for housing up in the Bronx. I mean, Ray was really a behind the scenes, like, master of getting things done and instigating great projects. And you know, what's great about working with the Kaplan Fund is that I ran into Ray's nephew at the Vera Institute a couple of years ago. I mean, the family, I always like to say, when you work with the Kaplan Fund, you're never more than a 1 degree of separation from virtually anybody you meet in New York City, which is one of the great joys of working with them.
And I think Ray also should get credit because he brought Suzanne Davidson to the fund, and she was such a wonderful presence for so many years. And you know, shout out to her. Back to our questions. An anonymous attendee has asked, preservation is preserving a smaller and smaller portion of the built environment. What can be done to make preservation more impactful and relevant for the future?
Well, I'd like to, Roberta, if I could just jump in and talk about the fact that I think the fund has made some critical grants around thinking about an expansive definition of preservation. Super proud that we were one of the first grants to the NYC LGBT Historic Sites project, which has also been co-founded by a Kaplan Fund alum, Ken Lustbader. And thinking a lot about heritage and social justice and the work that the fund is currently doing in the Black Belt of Alabama with civil rights sites and trying to lift up what has long been neglected heritage and thinking about not just obsessing over buildings, but stories and lives and places that matter. So that would be my quick answer. What do you think, Roberta?
I would say all of that is correct. I think that the sad news is that preservation in the most essential sense, I don't mean just in the, individual building. I mean, in terms of neighborhoods and in terms of the heritage fabric of the city has not been as under assault as it is today in a long time. And that is because the real estate industry is just trying to run all over the city and saying the preservationists are in the way, and yet they want to develop in the very neighborhoods that are the historic districts, which they opposed the designation of years ago. So it's a big fight today. It hasn't been as big in a long time, and there are a lot of people afraid to touch it, and this is troublesome.
One of our viewers, listeners, has raised an issue that I think just really builds on that. It's not a question, but they're calling out. I will add the word ridiculous. They didn't use it. This plan to basically clear cut the entire block south of Penn Station for a huge development of the Moses kind of era. I mean, that block that they want to take down, St. John's Baptist Church, etc., is just, horrendous that we're having an idea like this in 2021. This is the best we can come up with.
It's pure Robert Moses.
Yeah, and I'd say too, Tony, that I think what we're coming to understand, and this is sort of goes back to the early lessons of preservation and organizing, is that, just as Roberta said, people matter. Like thinking about the legacy of Central Brooklyn, Brownstone Brooklyn, the African-American communities that are really responsible for the fact that there is a Brownstone Brooklyn, and recognizing that there is a story and there's a power and identity of place for the folks that have lived and endured in those neighborhoods, and that they are also getting pushed out by an aggressive real estate market, and that we should do more. We need to do more to build power in those communities so that they can withstand some of that pressure and maintain a sense of place and power in those communities. So Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, these are communities that we really need to preserve, not just the building fabric, but the lives of the people that have really made those places so remarkable in New York.
And if I could add to that, people have to understand that historic preservation today is not just an upper class white thing. 20 years ago, I can remember people representing different Black communities of Brooklyn coming to the Landmarks Commission, appealing for designation of their districts because they want the same protections that white neighborhoods have. This crosses ethnic lines. It is, and all the people who want to call preservationists NIMBYs and all that, that's all name calling that is meaningless. It doesn't hold up under scrutiny.
I just want to do a couple of little more things back to the Q&A. Just a nice statement from Diana Waite, who has played such a key role over the years in the Preservation League and in its early days. And she just wanted to underscore the fact that it wasn't just the money from the fund, but it was knowing that the League project had the personal support of Joan. And that she came to so many of the events, which really was so important for a young organization. And I think that's so true. One of my first memories of Joan is seeing her and her mother come to a reception at the Municipal Art Society. We won't date that, but it does go back a bit.
Right.
A good question, taking us again, kind of just outside the city to the rest of the state. Cities seem to have a culture of preservation activism, especially in New York City. How do we foster that in more rural areas, especially if we artistically inclined do not live there? Any thoughts?
First of all, Tony, I would not assume there aren't people in those areas already trying to do that. One of the big mistakes is, as outsiders, we think that these communities don't have this kind of energy, bubbling up from below, and that's not true. Any community you go in, you will find the local historian, the local preservationist, and I think they can be encouraged, but the important thing is to find them and encourage them.
I also think there's a fundamental question around economies and what's happening in rural America and the real challenges that communities are facing, and finding ways that preservation can be a resource towards revitalization of places. One of my favorite towns in New York State is Ellicottville, which is in Western Cattaraugus County. And, they've been able to revitalize and really celebrate their Main Street. But they have some economic activity, right? Skiing and other things. So we have to look to opportunities that preservation should be seen as an engine of economic development, not a victim of economic development, right? In the sense of Roberta's concerns, as rightly so, around real estate development. So I think that's a partnership that can happen in more places in New York State, hopefully, than just
And
here.
I have to add, I just recently wrote a piece about this. If you want to see the rebirth already of downtowns that New York should learn from, I talked about the what I call the regional cities of New York State that are alive in many ways that New York is not, and having downtowns whose stores are not vacant and people are moving in and opening up businesses or renting space for business instead of coming into New York. So we should look at, you need to look at cities like Saratoga or Hudson or Millerton, particularly places that are getting more activity because the local mall that undercut them in the first place has been closed and will stay closed. And a lot of these downtowns are reviving in the good old-fashioned way, just at the same time that New York City is building more malls. So go figure.
I know Jay's presence suggests we are coming towards the end. There is one just brief question I want to highlight because I think it's in the theme of everything. And somebody writes in alerting us to the danger of the Soho NoHo rezoning that's going through. And they do ask, but they said there doesn't seem to be anyone opposed to it or noticing it. I just want to let them know there is. Village preservation is playing a big role in that. I think the Historic Districts Council. And I think the reason this is so dangerous is this is what the current approach is. People want to upzone historic districts, specifically targeting them, thinking that they're not dense enough. And of course, as we know, there's so much affordable housing and so much density in those districts already, and people just don't appreciate it because it's not high rise. But knowing, not wanting to never be invited back, I will let Jay jump in and wrap this up.
And I thought that was a wonderful program. I wanted to, on behalf of all the viewers, thank Roberta Gratz for this wonderful book and for her wonderful talk and comments tonight. It's clear what an important role the Kaplan Fund and all of its leadership played in the growth of the Preservation League over the years and continues to do in the future moving forward under Amy's guidance. And I'd also like to thank Tony Wood and Amy Freitag for their great questions and great facilitation of this panel. If you enjoyed this as much as I think you did, please go to our website, www.preservenys.org, and stay connected with us by making a donation. Then you'll be sure to be on our mailing list moving forward. So with that, I'd like to thank again our guests and our interviewers, Tony and Amy, and especially Roberta, for their time this evening, and hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you all.